I listened to the speech, and it was a great speech, and I agree with everything you said. But the first thing that I look when I'm looking at long term is in the 3R model is reduce. And I didn't hear anything about reducing the demand for mobility. Is that something that you're considering, or something that you agree with my sort of view on that? By the way, Hugh Davis from Coventry University. He did ask me to tell who I was from.
Thanks, sir. I'm going to take 3 questions if I can, if we've got 3 questions at this stage.
You said, look again, as a business, look again at the business where we should be in 2030 to be successful and profitable. How do we convince board members who are edging towards retirement to start investing in zero-emission vehicles when they could say, actually, to be successful and profitable for my dividend, I'll keep with ICE. So how do we make them leaders?
Okay, thank you very much. Gentleman at the back.
Phil Churchman from University of Leeds. I was taken by the point you made that we need to work with the world that we live in, not the one we want, or it might have been. To what extent do we need to work with the current political and economic order, or where do we need to change that in order to achieve the outcomes that we need?
Okay, John.
I'm sorry, I didn't quite hear the current political and...
The current economic and political order.
Yeah.
What's the boundary where we need to work with what we've got versus change it?
Okay, John, if you want to respond to those.
Yeah. Well, let me do the last one first, just very simply, because I had a wonderful argument. It was supposed to be a joint meeting with one of the Green members of the House of Lords, she and I were on this platform, and with about 300 people in the audience. They'd come to see in Surrey what they ought to do, working with the University of Surrey, as a matter of fact, what they ought to do, you see. So she got up and she said in her speech, first of all, that it didn't matter what you did individually, because that wasn't big enough to make any difference. And then she said, and anyway, what we have to have is system change before we can deal with climate change. I'm afraid I got up and said both of those are balls. I mean, that's just nonsense. First of all, we've got to do it ourselves, because nobody's going to listen to me unless I do it myself. I do have an electric car. I do actually have a heat pump. I do actually try to recycle as much as I possibly can. And as a family, we do as much walking and public transport as we can. That's not to be proud, because I'm lucky enough to be able to afford those things, and that is, I admit, absolutely so. But if I didn't do that, how could anybody expect the chairman of the Climate Change Committee or the ex-chairman of the Climate Change Committee to be listened to? So first of all, we do have to do it ourselves. And in a sense, that's the first thing I'd say to the board member. You know, just a moment, you have, maybe retiring, but you do actually have a responsibility to set an example for other people. And if you're not that kind of person, you're never going to convince him or her, as a matter of fact, but you do have to do that. But the second thing is, we're not going to get system change in time. This is something we've got to do in the next 10 years. We have a decade to do this. And therefore, what we have to do is to make the system we have work. Now, that's not easy. Anybody who's watched the shenanigans at the Conservative Party conference, and I can say that as sitting as a Conservative member of the House of Lords, will see just how difficult it's going to be. People pretending that you don't need to do things because they're inconvenient. We had several of them showing that attitude. Well, we have to fight it. We have to make it clear. We have to make the present system work. And so how much do we do with it? Well, we have to make it work. And there are some things that don't work, and we'll have to change those. But don't think we're going to have system change in time. And if I may say so philosophically, when I look back, system change doesn't usually deliver what the people who wanted the system to change wanted in the first place. I don't think the Russian Revolution had quite the results which people wanted. I don't think the French Revolution had it. The English Revolution certainly didn't either. So let us just recognise that we have to make the present system work, and that's hugely important. Now, the trouble with asking three questions together, I hadn't got my notebook out, so I hadn't written it down quickly enough to see what the other ones were. But you were asking about reducing the transport. I'm not sure what I really think you mean by that. If you mean the overall amount of moving about, I'm not in favour of that at all. In fact, I think there's a great deal of importance which we ought to recognise as given to people's lives in the ability not to have to be in the same place and just be part of a particular group. We've lost a lot because of that. That is absolutely true. But I am a historian by training, and one of the things I always have tried to get people to think about is once you go back 4 generations, most people never moved more than about 3 miles in the whole of their lives. I'm not sure that that's the life I want everybody today to have. What we've got to ask is how they move about, and that is a different issue. And talking about public transport and opportunities to be able to move more readily is the first thing. A shift is very important, and you need to shift in a way in which you shift to something which is actually a contributor to net zero. I really do think that people in the future will be able to move about more readily. But we've also got to recognise that the issue of individual transport can now be made much less difficult by modern technology. So if you mean also that instead of us thinking about the motor car as something that we own ourselves, a separate one, I'm looking forward to a stage in which we will move away from that, and there will be motor cars available in a very simple manner, and we will be able to move about individually. So it won't all be public transport, but it will be available in a way which doesn't mean it'll be a service rather than an ownership model. And we should certainly be moving in that direction. I do think that we have been foolish in not recognising the big changes which need to be made in public transport. I sat next to the man who was the first privatised chief of Anglian Railways. And he said to me, "Why do you think that all freight from Felixstowe, which was in my constituency, goes to Manchester via London when it's manifestly ridiculous?" And I said, "I don't know." He said, "Because there was a row in the 1880s between the Great Eastern Railway and the Grand Central Railway, and the Great Eastern Railway said if they were going to charge that sort of sum, they were going to send everything by a different railway route. And that continued until privatisation, when somebody actually looked at it. And that's why it doesn't do it that way now, because they've raised the bridges and such like so they can send it much more directly. The bus routes in London, when they gave freedom to the bus services, we sometimes forget the good things that happened when that happened. And people asked why the buses seemed to go from places that people didn't want to go from to places that people didn't want to go to. And what they discovered was, of course, the bus replaced the tram. And the tram had to go between those places because that was where the tram lines were. So one of the things we have to do is to be much more creative about how we look at the services that we provide for people, and much more willing to change them as they change their own ways of transport and their own wishes. That we can do if we're quicker off the feet. And that's why I'm a bit worried about discussions about privatisation or public ownership or whatever else it is. It seems to me what we really need is creative ownership, the willingness to change, quickness for innovation. All that is what we really need.
John, thank you very much. I'm going to take 2 questions. I'm eating into your coffee break, but I think two more questions at this stage. I really want a lady to be asking a question here. lady here, and then the gentleman 2 rows from the back.
Hi, Louise Evans from Energy UK. I think in Claire Hayes' speech, she mentioned about pricing and kind of what happens when fuel duty disappears as we transition. And I just wondered if you had any thoughts on what road pricing might look like, and is that the right option? How do we get people on board with that? And any thoughts you had on that?
Thank you very much. So, gentleman, 3 rows back. Can't count.
Hello, Alec Peachy from Transport and Energy. Lord Deben, you spoke about the importance of government putting a focus on clean power by 2030 and how as further progress is made in this area, the risk is that it might obviously further highlight emissions in other areas such as transport and buildings. With that in mind, how key is it that we break down those silos and ensure that the transport and energy sectors work together? And do you think that that's happening enough at a central government level with those respective departments?
Thank you very much. John.
Well, I'm afraid that it's my fault, but I didn't catch the first question properly, so I'll answer the second one, and then you can say it again if you don't mind.
So
the silos in government are very serious, and they are as serious in this government as they have been in previous ones. They are always a problem. I suffered from it all those years ago for the 16 years I was a minister. It was always true that unless you had a particular connection with people, the Cambridge Mafia was quite useful in my time, actually, because we knew each other well enough to be able to do that. But in general, the departments found it really difficult to think about things together. And we're going to have to do our best, and the Net Zero Transport group is going to do its best to try to be much closer to the departments which are not transport. And indeed, in future meetings, we're very determined to have DEFRA coming and explaining what they are doing to deal with the things which matter to us. Similarly, you can't think about transport unless you think what the Ministry of Defence is doing. You can't think about the issues that we're doing when you think of any of the users of the facilities that we have. It's just not just transport. It's DESNES, it's the Department of Local Government. All these departments need to be thinking about how can we deal with public transport unless the Department of Local Government is fully involved in working these things through. So you're quite right to raise the issue. I don't have an answer, except we just have to go on trying all the time. And we ourselves have got to be careful not to be siloed ourselves. That means not just to think of the Ministry of Transport from our point of view, but also as companies. If I may say so, businesses are pretty siloed very often. I advise in Sancroft a whole range of very large and quite a lot of small businesses. And I'm very fascinated by the number of times that I, as the consultant, know more about the things in the different departments than the people who head the departments. And I bet you've come across that in the same way. We worked for Coca-Cola over very many years, and I have to say, I am sometimes the longest standing person in the room because we've done that. And one of our problems in government and in business is the short-lived nature of people in each of the departments or parts of businesses, so that they don't have history and they don't have a cross-business or government concept, and those two things are absolutely essential. Now, I must come back to the lady there. I'm sorry, it's my hearing, I think.
Sorry, I'll speak louder into the microphone. As fuel duty kind of disappears as we transition to electric vehicles, there's a lot of talk and discussion about road pricing. So I wondered what your thoughts on that, and is there a way that we can get people on board with that? It's obviously very controversial, so just wondered your thoughts.
Well, first of all, the problem with any change of this sort is that people always compare what you want to do with some idealised version of where we are. So if you talk about road pricing, they all think about it as having to pay money which they don't have to pay now, if you see what I mean. They always think of it in that way. And if you looked at the ridiculous debates in the Greater London elections, you'd have thought they were living in in a totally different world from the world in which we all live. The fact of the matter is, at the moment, we raise the money that we need for government and for road building and for repairs. We raise that in a particular way which won't work when you have an electric vehicle fleet, because we raise it on tax, on petrol, and we raise it on the way in which we tax vehicles. We've got to rethink that. Now, most people think that a road pricing system is probably the fairest and best way of doing this in the future. We couldn't do it in the past because we didn't have the technology for it. We do now have the technology for it. All I say to people is I don't much mind, I don't have a particular view about what system, because there are all sorts of systems you could use. But what I do want people to say is you can't go on with the present system. It's no good. This is what I mean about living in the world in which we live. The present system is based upon a vehicle structure which we won't have. So if you want to recognise that, you must now start thinking and having a discussion about it, but realising that people get very upset about the idea of paying any money for anything. They deeply believe that the government won't take the money off that they're now paying. All they'll do is to put some more money on. So you do have to start off by making it absolutely clear that what you're doing here is an alternative to what you're doing here, and that you won't be doing this as well as this. And now that means a proper national debate. But nobody's prepared to have the national debate, because what happened when the Mayor of London wanted to have some debate about it, what was it? His opponent said he wants road pricing. You're all going to have to pay all this money. You're the people, the poorest, who have to go furthest, they're going to... I mean, the debate stopped at that point. He had to say, I'm not going to introduce road pricing. Well, he wasn't anyway. All he wanted to do was to have a proper discussion about what we should be doing. And I think we've got to have a proper discussion about it, because there are real issues here, and there are real issues of equity. And the one thing I forgot to do was to say I'm so pleased that our chairman constantly talks about the just transition. I prefer the phrase fair transition, because I think just sounds a bit close to the courts, and I know quite a number of people who prefer not to be too close to the courts. So I think fair transition is a better phrase. But the fact is, fair transition, this is one of the areas. How do you make sure that people are not finding themselves put in a worse position because you change the system? We just have to think about those who are most affected, and how do you do this in a fair way? It's like water rates. I never understand why people object to paying for the water. What you do is to have a basic rate which is very cheap for people's basic needs in water. And then you charge the hell out of people who want water for their swimming pools. That's what you do, and that's fair, and it's reasonable. I don't understand why we can't understand that about road traffic and such like.